Afternoon, everybody. I'm back after trying to uh, film with my Logitech software on the computer. For some reason, it's crapping out. I'm not sure what's going on, so I figure we'll just do another live stream. I do want to. I'm kind of in the mood to talk about this stuff, so while it's kind of fresh in my head. So for this one, thanks very much for excuse me, sorry. Thanks very much for joining me for the previous one on the Dark Phoenix comics. Um, this one will be movies. There's a bit of a comic link with this one. We're going to be talking about this Jose Larraz Blood Hunger box set that I got recently from Arrow Video. There was a few online sales, and Arrow is a company that I really, really like. I've got a few box sets, two Seijun Suzuki box sets, but they put out some really quality stuff, kind of along the lines of, for me, what used to be companies like Blue Underground, for example. There's so many of these. There's so many of these kind of niche DVD and Blu-ray um, companies right now. uh, Mondo Macabro jumps to mind, Synapse jumps to mind. Like I said, Arrow Video. There's a lot of really great stuff, and an appeal for me has always been kind of the European side of what would be called kind of exploitation cinema from kind of the 70s, specifically the 70s, dipping into the 60s a little bit too, for sure. But Jose Larraz is a guy that many years ago, when I was doing kind of tape trading, there was a few websites out there where you could get some pretty obscure kind of documentaries and stuff. Um, and one of the series that I had always wanted to see was a show called Erotica. I think it was, I don't remember how many episodes it was, but it was a UK produced Pete Tomes, I believe. A couple of guys that are now associated with the company Mondo Macabro, actually. James Watson, hello, how are you? A couple of people that are associated with Mondo Macabro. They did these documentaries. They did a bunch of documentaries where they looked at kind of European cinema and kind of erotic cinema, that sort of thing, of the 60s, the 70s. This was kind of before a time hardcore movies kind of came into the scene and really almost ruined the ability of some of these kind of what would be called maybe a little more artistic filmmakers. I seem like I'm really jumpy there. Hopefully it's not pausing and jumping around too much on you. This Hangout on Air is live. Hangouts on Air is going away later this year. For quick streaming, try youtube.com webcam. Well, that's an interesting notice coming up there. That kind of sucks. Anyway, so with the show Erotica, it just opened my eyes to some directors that I knew a little bit, guys like Jess Franco, but then exposed me to guys that I had never heard of before. Jose Larraz is one of those guys that is kind of forefront in my mind when it comes to people they focused on that series, where watching the kind of clips and hearing him talk, he was a guy that I just had to see more of, and it never really, his stuff never really crossed my path. Uh, as with a lot of this type of cinema, it's not something that's kind of readily available. You kind of have to dig for it a little bit. And if you are watching this channel, you know that I do like to dig for things that are a little more kind of obscure for us here in North America anyway. I'm assuming that, like a lot of the stuff that I do enjoy, when you travel to other parts of the world, it's maybe a little more readily available. So for an American audience, or North American audience rather, especially something that's going to be subtitled into English, or a couple of these dubbed into English, it's not always the easiest to get our hands on something that we can see. Of course, that all changes with the internet. So Jose Larraz was born in Spain in 1929, and what I didn't know when I started reading a little bit more about him, he started off as a comic book writer. He was writing for magazines like Pilote and Spirou. His most well-known creation was the action comic series Paul Foran, which he wrote under the name Gil, Gil. Uh, so that was kind of a surprise to me, but then again, not really much of a surprise. It seems like a lot of these guys dip their toes into the comic world. I mean, you look at a guy like Alejandro Jodorowsky, and he went full on into comics after doing a bunch of movies, you know. So it seems like those kind of worlds were mixed somewhat, and that always interests me as well because the way that some of these movies are often presented, they almost have, yeah, there's an erotic element to them, yeah, there's nudity, yeah, there's some softcore sex, but there's also things like, I don't know, there's just heavy atmosphere. There's unique scenes, there's unique kind of setups, there's a real, I don't know, they kind of sit, for me, they kind of sit in their own little world when it comes to film on the whole. Out of anything that I've watched throughout my life, you really can put stuff into these little areas that sort of speak the same language. And it seems like a lot of these European erotic movies, or Spanish specifically in this case, and Jess Franco's case, really hold their own place in kind of the history. And there was a little more of an art to it, even though that part of that art, the directors and the people creating this stuff, they wanted to tell these stories through relationships and through sex and through nudity and all these kind of things, because they were also playing for a certain audience. I'm pretty sure I've talked about it before on this channel, when talking about some of these movies. Some of the greatest stories that I've heard from these directors are kind of things like, at the end of the day, the producers who had the money, all they cared about was that at every 4 minutes I showed a naked woman. Other than that, they didn't care what I did with the story. They didn't care what the story was about. They didn't care about any of that one little bit. The sole purpose of these movies was to play as either the pre-feature B movie or the grade Z movie, something that was just going to play in the theaters and get them money in a quick fashion. Where that money has come from, even up to this point today, we can have another conversation about maybe, where this money is funneling in from to make these kind of movies. But at the end of the day, these guys, and in some cases, very few cases, women, were given free reign to create whatever the hell they wanted, as long as at the 4 minute mark you saw a pair of tits. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the only thing that had them going. So with that said, you're getting these people who are just very creative and have something to say in some unique way, and just, all they need is that freedom to do it. There's really nobody else looking over their shoulder. So it's always fascinated me. So when I got this box set, I couldn't wait. I kind of went 3 nights in a row, and I watched one movie a night. I haven't dug into a lot of the special features yet. I think all of these have commentary tracks. Not quite sure. There's a lot of bonus features on all of these. I kind of went backwards. When I'm talking about these, we're going to go in the way that it's supposed to. And we're going to start off with one called Whirlpool. And this was Larraz's first film. I believe it was 1970. 87 minutes. Yeah, 1970. So it's interesting. When I started off with the vampires, and this one really is set in a world where I have some previous experience, kind of like a gothic erotic horror movie. Takes place in a castle, a lot of female vampires, usually in pairs, going and kind of feeding on people. A little bit of mystery surrounding it, lots of slow motion, lots of kind of ethereal scenes taking place. I kind of have a really good footing in that. So when I'm presented with that kind of movie, I know what I'm going to get and I know what's going to happen. that all changed with these two movies here, The Coming of Sin and Whirlpool, because there isn't much of that footing. Well, there's not much of there's none of that footing in these two movies whatsoever. So Whirlpool, little bit psycho, little bit blow up, little bit kind of um, American Euro trash by way of Something Weird Video, the company Something Weird Video. There's some of that kind of really low budget vibe to this, but on top of that, there's something really interesting going on. And one of the things that helped for me anyway to put this film over the top was Stelvio Cipriani, who is the composer on this. He does the music for it, and it fits so unbelievably well to kind of add to what's already an unusual kind of atmosphere. There's a few scenes that take place out in the woods. It's basically this woman and her nephew, and how they try to rope in a young woman to kind of be part of their relationship. There's lots of booze, there's lots of people popping pills, and then there's lots of sex. Um, but the son, this nephew rather, not the son, the nephew is a photographer as well. And as we start to find out a little more about him, we see that some of the way he's getting these photos is maybe a little more questionable, kind of putting the women that he's photographing uh, um, in kind of danger, even though it's very orchestrated danger from his standpoint. The women that are involved don't know that. And I don't want to give away too much of the story. Not that a ton of you are going to rush out to see these movies, but just kind of it jumps off from there. So there's a number of scenes out in the woods, and there's one in particular where it seems very kind of innocuous, but the music isn't full on slasher movie. You can gather from the music something is going to happen. The music is subdued enough where it fits the scene, and it doesn't foreshadow what's coming, even though the stuff that happens isn't horrific. And I think that's one thing to kind of talk about right off the bat with these. Are there some questionable things going on in these movies? For sure there are. Are they to the degree of kind of a slasher movie? Not even close. When you're seeing any sort of violence, there's a guy that gets stabbed in that whirlpool, for example. Our main male character stabs this guy. It is so unbelievably. What I've heard is a lot of times there was this very specific red nail polish that they would use for the blood to make it this really bright red thing that would just get everywhere. Um, very fake looking. It's by no means, we're not talking about spending a ton of money on prosthetics and making things look realistic with these movies. There's this kind of fantastic element to it, this fantasy kind of element to all of these films that I think is really important to keep in mind. Does that mean that some of the things that happen in this movie still don't kind of raise your eyebrows a little bit? For sure, there's a couple of those moments, absolutely. Um, so they're definitely not movies for everybody. So in this scene, there's nothing foreshadowing what's going to happen, but the music works so well with it, kind of creating this innocence, but there's still this kind of edge to it that worked incredibly well. And I would say this movie on the whole, uh, it wasn't my favorite of the three, but individual scenes I thought worked very well to just kind of capture this mood. Um, and it had a kind of a bummer, kind of a downer ending too, which kind of took me by surprise. It didn't go the way that I thought it was going to go, which is always a nice surprise when that happens to you. Overall, really great. You can see right out of the gate that Larraz has something going for him. He's got something with his style that's a little bit more unique. Um, not being a scholar of these kind of films, and I haven't seen every single one, there definitely, you can feel something with this movie that's just not always there. There's something else going on. Probably the most infamous out of these three for me is The Coming of Sin. The other title was Violation of the Bitch, is what it was called. This one has come out in a number of formats over the years. A lot of them heavily edited, and then there was a couple. What they used to do with some of these softcore films, depending on where it played, they would shoot hardcore scenes. Once that transition started happening, what year do we have here for this one? I don't remember. I want to say like 76. I'm not seeing a year readily here, especially without my glasses. But I want to say mid to late 70s anyway. Um, so there was a couple of versions that were put out there where there was hardcore scenes shot, and they show a couple of the clips of them in the special features where they're talking about the history of this film. The idea was to have it play in these other markets. The difference with the hardcore scene films, the hardcore scenes that were filmed for this one, they really went out of their way to really nail the wardrobe, really nail the even the wigs and everything. So it almost is seamless. It is still a bit of a jump, but you know what I mean. So the image that stands out for me is this one here. We have our main actress who's having these nightmares of a man on a horse coming to get her. This man on the horse manifests himself in the real world, but we cut to these dreams, and apparently this was the image that came to Larraz that sparked the whole thing. I don't know if it was a vision, I don't know if it was a dream, but he had this image like seared in his mind of a woman inside a hollowed out horse, and that's what sparked this whole story. So again, we have um, there's almost elements of repulsion in here as far as you have this isolated main character. She's not necessarily as terrified of the world as maybe she was in Repulsion, but there is this kind of, she set herself away from people. This young girl enters her life 19 years old, I think, um, and they start a romantic relationship. And then you get a little more into kind of the dynamics and our other main character's outlook on the world and outlook on kind of sexuality. And I think that's also something that really stands out in a lot of these films. Sure, a lot of what they put in these were just the base. We just want to get asses in the seats. We want to get the trench coat crowd out to the movie theaters. So we're going to have a couple of women getting naked and making out. But there is something about this one where she does talk about relationships, about how she really responds to relationships with women. She's had relationships with men throughout her life, but it's when she only wants something very specific because men are very base and blah, blah, blah. She finds that relationships with women are much more rewarding, not just sexual, just in general. Um, so it has some interesting things going on. And again, once this figure manifests himself on his horse, we sort of transition into when you're stuck in a dream, when you're dreaming yourself, or at least it is for me, when you're kind of thrown from moment to moment and there's really, you don't have a choice. This movie feels like that because there's a couple of things that happen that the young woman is kind of us in some respects, where she's saying, don't do this, can't you see what's going to happen, what are you doing? But things just keep propelling themselves forward and there's nothing that she can do about it, when in reality it would be very easy to stop some of the things. You know, as the guy comes to visit them in the house, for example, and the older woman lets him in, they could have easily just not let him in, you know, but the older woman kind of has this outlook of almost like a realization that she's in not quite a movie, that she's kind of a realization that she's a character to some degree, and she's going to just go with the flow of whatever comes at her. She's going to want to experience, and she does throughout the movie. And the young woman is still kind of scared of that. Um, so really, again, another unique, just very unique story. And by the end, uh, mildly predictable end, but I don't think it ruined it for me, because the trip, the journey itself was pretty great. And again, just a lot of great visuals. I don't remember who did the soundtrack on this one. I don't think it was anyone who jumped out at me though. Yeah, no, I don't. There's nothing written on the back here. I don't remember who did the music, and honestly, the music doesn't stand out. There's nothing I remember specifically about the soundtrack on this one. So that's The Coming of Sin. And finally, in the box set, the one that I watched first because I was really excited about it, Vampires. Absolutely Just really, really great. Yeah, Laser Duchamp, excellent. Born in Barcelona, Larraz moved to Paris in 1952, where he started his career as a comics writer for magazines like Pilote and Spirou. Yeah, I was mentioning, I don't know if you've been here since the beginning. There was one that he was really well known for. It's going to make me go back into my uh, Tintin magazines to see if he made an appearance in those as well. Um, so vampires, we get kind of the classic erotica uh, horror with the two female vampires who are kind of bringing men into their lure and feeding off of them. The difference with this one is that one of the men is kept alive so they can feed off him kind of intermittently. So for the whole movie, he is kind of, for most of the movie anyway, he's walking around and stumbling around like in a dazed kind of state until he starts to kind of snap out of it. He can't leave the site even when she leaves to go and bring other men to the site. He can't leave the castle. He's kind of drawn to her. So there's a bit of a romance in it as well, only for him to get fed off of again, until finally it kind of comes to a head where by the end of it, you're not sure if the whole thing was just an illusion or what parts were real, which is generally a kind of a cop out type of ending. I thought it worked okay in here. I would have preferred to not have seen that. You know, they could have ended it a little earlier and I would have been equally as satisfied. These ones are great. The and again, it's all about the atmosphere. It's all about that stuff for me with these kind of movies. And this one just really, really delivers. I mean, it's kind of it's pretty standard fare for this style of the erotic horror from 70s. There's nothing there's nothing that stands out in this one that really to me sets it too far apart from other movies of this kind. What impressed me the most about this box set were these other two, Whirlpool and The Coming of Sin. Just because I wasn't quite expecting that. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I sure as hell wasn't expecting those. This one was very, very satisfying, though. Really, really great. So the other thing you get, which I haven't dug through yet, with Arrow Video box sets, they always do a fantastic job of presenting a little write-up, the history of the films themselves, some interviews, some essays. They give you a nice kind of backstory. There's even a section there on the music. So I'll be digging into this tonight more than likely to give a bit of a read, maybe get a bit of a read on Larraz's past. So I'm hoping that this is the first in a couple for Arrow Video. I would love to see more come out, another couple of box sets come out. Really, really glad I finally got my hands on it. There was a copy here in town at our Sunrise Records, but even with shipping, because of the sale, I ended up saving quite a few bucks ordering this online than buying it just down the road. So if you're into anything along these lines, I would recommend giving this a look. Really just give Arrow Video a look in general. They really run the gamut of films that they present, but this is a real solid box set. So thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate you tuning in for something a little out of the ordinary on the channel. But for those of you who hung out, James Watson, Laser Duchamp, thanks very much for tuning in. I do appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon when I don't know, I'll probably do some more. I have a couple of other films coming that I got on a sale as well through Synapse. So once I get those in the player, I'll probably talk about those as well to maybe do kind of a semi-regular movie series now that I seem to be getting right back into watching more films again. Thanks very much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.